I know?
Occupy Vancouver! What is going on? The revolution is not dead yet. We are going strong.
Evolution!
The evolution, the evolution.
Hasta la revolución! Hasta la evolución!
The sun shines its fire on everybody, and it's charging us up. I'm glad everyone's here on the sunny side of the street. We have our special guest, Starhawk, is here to share with us today some of her experiences from the front line. Connecting this chain, what we're doing here, back to the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, Paris in the 1700s, Greece in the 2000 BC, whatever it is, we are still going strong and change is happening. We are popping up like a fruit of the mushroom. The mycorrhiza have spread and connected, and now we're popping up all over the place, all over the world. And Starhawk is here to give us some encouragement, some insights, some practical tools we can use for working in groups, group collaboration, bringing magic into our work and our play. I guess you're all here because you know who Starhawk is. She is a very well-known activist, author, permaculturist, Wiccan, high priestess, academic, author, just general inspirer of those who seek change in our world. Starhawk. We're very grateful to have Starhawk here. She is here this weekend giving a workshop, and I co-opted her to come speak to Occupy. She has several Occupies in the U.S., and she'll talk a bit about that. Thank you.
Hello, Occupy Vancouver. It's really great. I feel like it's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here and to be able to connect with you all. And first of all, I just want to honor the incredible work that you've all been doing here with the occupation and with the activism here in Vancouver and in British Columbia. That is fantastic. I wonder how many of you, is this the first time you've really been involved with activism? A couple of you. How many of you were involved maybe a long time ago and kind of got reignited by the Occupy movement?
Always been here.
All right. How many of you have been activists for a long time? Great. It's so wonderful to see like the diversity in this movement and the way that this has brought people who are kind of, you can say, hardcore or seasoned or veteran activists out, and also brought out so many new people who haven't really done this before. And to me, that's been one of the great strengths of the movement. I've been involved with several of them. I live in San Francisco, so you can sort of say Occupy San Francisco's been kind of my home occupation, but the Occupy movement neglected to consult my schedule before it started to happen. And I already had much traveling planned for the fall. So in the course of it, it's been kind of lucky in a way that I've been able to go to a number of different other places, from Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C. and McPherson Square there back in October, to San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and Santa Cruz and some of our Bay Area places, and also down to L.A. And there's even an occupation in Fort Myers, Florida, tiny little conservative town on the West Coast. I've also been able to be on phone calls in some of the national organizing, and it's amazing, really. Like, I was on one call where it took more than 45 minutes just for everyone to say what their name was and what the occupation was they were working with. And these are going on in places like Boise, Idaho, and West Palm Beach, and places that are not really hotbeds of ferment and activation normally. So to me, that's been an enormous strength of the movement. In some ways, this movement reflects the way that we now more than ever are globally interconnected, no matter where we are. And in some sense, I feel like it reflects almost a global kind of shift in consciousness that's happening. It seems like spontaneously, but of course it's not really spontaneously. It's something that the ground has been prepared for many, many years. Right now, our movement's at a kind of a challenging point. You know, the last couple of weeks we've seen some of the big occupations have been driven out of their sites. The police have cracked down. There's been a lot of heavy police brutality in a lot of different places. And it's also winter, and in many places, I know you are all Canadians, and a little winter doesn't bother you. Especially not, you know, the wussy winter you have in British Columbia, right? It's hardly winter at all, right? But, in other places, winter is a pretty serious thing. So I think people are all kind of saying, all right, what's the next phase going to be? Where does the movement go from here? What's the next thing that we're going to do? How do we make it clear that driving us out of our campsites is not driving the movement out? It's just kind of like, any of you ever planted comfrey in one of your garden beds and then tried to dig it out? And you dig out the main root and all the little roots disperse, and by next spring you've got nothing but a bed of comfrey. Well, we have to be like the comfrey. You know, we are.
We want comfrey.
Yeah. And I'm not here to tell you what I think the movement should do. To be honest, I don't know. I think that's something that all together we will figure out collectively. But I want to reflect a little bit on what I think the movement has already done, and why I think this somewhat mad tactic of camping out in the public square and occupying things has actually been so successful. One of the things that it did was it created something that I think we have all been hungry for and not known, and that is a commons, a town square, a gathering place, a place where we actually come together and meet face to face and have community, not just on Facebook, you know, and not just online, but actually interacting with real live human beings and interacting about stuff that's important. You know, not just who you're dating or what your relationship status is, although that is very important, especially when it's you. There's nothing more important. Not just what you're buying or what your favorite product is, but what are we going to do as a species, as the nations that we are, as a global society, when we're faced with something we all intuitively know we have to deal with, which is this little necessity that's come up to completely change our technology, our economy, our food growing systems, our energy systems, our way of life, if we're not going to destroy the basic climate conditions of the planet, and if we're going to be able to address the incredible injustices that have now become so obvious, so blatant to everybody, that the system itself is losing its legitimacy. I think we're all starving to talk about that, to have that conversation and to figure out what to do. And it's become really clear that that conversation is not what's happening in Washington, D.C., in the halls of power, and it's not happening in Ottawa, and it's not happening in the UN, and it's not happening among those people we've elected or entrusted to figure out those directions. So we've got to take it back, and we've got to do that ourselves, and we've got to set the direction. There's an old political slogan that says, you know, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And we have to be in the lead right now. So setting up those occupations provided a space for that to happen. And having those general assemblies, even though, you know, a lot of the time those general assemblies You might have felt they were frustrating or boring or overly long or whatever, but they were a place where once again people could come and speak and be heard and have a community that is listening and that is wrestling with these questions. That's been a tremendous achievement, because I think one thing that happens is when you have that, suddenly you have a taste of that, and you realize it's like you've been starving, but you've been so hungry, you kind of like you've lost your appetite, and then somebody gives you a little bowl of healthy soup, and suddenly you're ravenous. And I think that's what we're feeling now. We've had that little taste. We're ravenous. We want more, right? So I think that's one of the questions we can look at as a movement is, all right, if we don't have the tents, and if we're being driven out of public spaces, how do we create a space for that to happen? How do we create a commons where that conversation can go on? How do we learn to be even more skillful in having that conversation so that the meetings aren't long and frustrating and boring? Well, they probably will be long, actually. And there are times they inevitably will be frustrating, but they certainly shouldn't be boring, right? How do we have this way that we can dialogue together? And how do we get really good at dealing with our own internal conflicts? How do we create a space where we can argue passionately for what we believe in and still respect one another and still respect our differences? Second thing that the movement has done is it has totally changed the national dialogue about economic inequality, at least in the United States and I think also in Canada. Suddenly, even all the right-wing politicians are adopting the language of the 99%, and everyone's scrambling to position themselves as being for the 99%. And when you think back, back in the U.S. in August when we were going through the whole debt ceiling debacle, nobody was even really talking about economic inequality. It was all about, are we going to raise the debt? Are we not going to raise, Now, that's on the table. That's been brought out into the light. And that's one of the most powerful things that a direct action can do. And the whole occupation has been a very powerful form of direct action. It's like a giant spotlight. It shows a light on things that people haven't been paying attention to and says, look at this. When it shows a light on something that's blatantly unjust, like our current economic system, then people look at it and it also starts to leach away the legitimacy that system has had. People had sort of accepted, oh yeah, I guess that's the way life is. CEOs make huge amounts of money and I'm losing my home, but I guess I'm just not very smart, right? Now, instead of that, people can look at that and go, you know what? This is wrong. This is absolutely wrong that some banker who basically committed fraud and illegal acts should be getting hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses while I'm losing my home. And I'm not the only one. You are too. And he is over there and she is over there. We've got to get together and do something about it. So when that system starts to lose legitimacy, systems that lose their legitimacy lose our consent. And when they lose our consent, they fall. When the Soviet Union fell, it was because the underpinnings of people's belief in it, people's consent to it, people's belief in its legitimacy eroded away. It became so clear that it wasn't functional that ultimately it had to collapse. Unfortunately, when systems fall, too often they're replaced by something that isn't necessarily any better unless we have a strong vision in our mind of what we want to replace it with that's different. Otherwise, we get what happened in Egypt with the revolution, on January 25th, where they threw out the dictator, but they got the military. And now they're faced with another revolution and another crisis to throw out the military in order to get the actual democracy that they want. The right wing, they spend millions on think tanks. They have people who spend their lives sitting around strategizing, coming up with plans, coming up with ideas that they can put out into the world, that they can fund academic departments to teach people from the third world, like the Chicago School did with globalization, with countries from Latin America, coming up with things that they can feed to the media, so that when stuff starts to shift and change and collapse, they've got a ready-made set of ideas and plans and programs for us all that are there, that are easy to grasp. We often don't have that because nobody is funding us to sit around in think tanks and think, unfortunately. But we luckily are able to think anyhow, right? And I think that that's one of the things that we need to do as a movement, is to say, okay, we know we don't want what we got, so what is it we do want? How are we going to organize it? The whole Occupy movement and all the things we've been doing, we can look at it as a great laboratory of experimentation, of taking democracy back to its basic roots. Everyone gets together in the town square, argues about things, everyone has an equal voice, and now we can look at it and say, that's great. Now we can start to get more sophisticated. Now we can start to say, all right, the big General Assembly with everybody having a chance to speak is one form. That's good for certain things. There might be other forms. Some of the occupations are moving to a spokes council form for certain kinds of decisions, and that's a form we've used in organizing in horizontal, flat, non-hierarchical organizations for decades around organizing actions and mobilizations. That's really good for allowing people to all have their own voice in a different way. Because, you know, if you've got 1,000 people there, in theory you might all get to speak, but in reality, if you each got to speak for a moment, that meeting would go on for 1,000 minutes, which I don't know how many hours that is, but it's more than 10, right? Yeah. If you have a spokes council and you have people meeting in small groups, in that small group you can have a lot more time to think and talk and hammer out an idea, and then you can send somebody to convey those ideas into another group, and you're part of shaping that in a different way. There are probably other forms we haven't even tried yet or invented yet. There's a million different processes and ways to have discussions, and maybe later in this little time we spend together, we might try some of them out and play with some of them to see how they work. For, you know, not every discussion needs to come to a consensus. Sometimes we need to discuss things to hear the whole range of ideas that people have around something, and then to think about it and mull it over and let it evolve, and not necessarily have to come to some decision about it immediately. And when we do that, oftentimes we can actually hear each other and speak and listen in a deeper kind of way. So I would say, finally, the other thing that I think the Occupy movement has done so beautifully is it's given a voice to this incredible frustration that people feel, and it's given people a platform and a way to get together and take action about it. And because of that, it's given a boost to every other form of activism that was going on. You know, there's a phenomenon that if you're sitting home alone in your house, and you don't know anyone who's going out to do anything, you tend to sit home alone in your house. You might watch the news, you might swear at the TV, but actually getting your butt out of there, right, and down and out on the street, it's hard to do if you don't have any support for it. But once you do, you come down to the occupation, you meet people, you make friends, and then you hear, oh, there's a demonstration about the pipeline tomorrow, you're 100 times more likely to get up and get out to that demonstration. And you might even call your friends and say, well, let's all go out to this demonstration. And you know what? All that frustration we've been feeling, all those churning ulcers and things, it actually feels better when you get out and go out on the street and do something about it. There's a wonderful feeling when we all come together and we're not alone and we're raising our voices together. And so it's given this tremendous momentum to every other form of progressive organizing and action. So I think even if the Occupy movement, even if we all went home tomorrow, never came out again, and spent the rest of our lives playing Fruit Ninja on our iPads, the Occupy movement would already have accomplished a huge amount. But are we going to do that? You sound a little tempted, right? You sure? No, we're not. We're not going to go back. We're going to continue going forward and moving together and taking action together and pushing the movement into the new direction in the next phase. And eventually, I think we'll have the powers that be going like, why did we ever think it was a good idea to push them out of their occupations? Why didn't we just let them stay at the art gallery? It was so much easier then than what they're doing now. Yeah. I want to say just a word or two about history and legacy, because I think it's important to know that the Occupy movement didn't spring out of nothing. It has a long history and it has a long legacy of movements that have organized in this way of direct democracy and decentralized power. In some ways, those movements go way back. Maybe they go back to Athens, to people meeting in the public square, although you had to be male and you had to be a citizen and you couldn't be a slave, so it wasn't exactly a complete democracy. Maybe they go even further back to people in indigenous cultures all over the world who've always made decisions and met in council and had their own ways of coming to decisions and talking together. And consensus itself as a form has its roots, first of all, in the Onondaga Nation's form of decision-making, which was also a direct influence in the United States on our Constitution and our system of checks and balances. It has its roots in the Quakers, who came out of a time where there was enormous political ferment and revolt in England, and developed a religion that basically honored the inner light in everyone and developed a system of governance for themselves that said, we're going to we'll be silent, we'll listen, and everyone will have a chance to speak, and we won't move forward until a sense of the group develops and carries us in a certain direction. You could say we have our roots back in the diggers in the 16th century in England, in the 1600s, who went and said, hey, we're poor, we're going to just take waste ground that no one's using, and we are going to start farming it, and the world actually should not be divided into rich and poor. It's a common treasury that should belong to all, and we're going to start just living that way. In some sense, they lost, like us. The authorities came in and pulled down their cottages and drove them out. But in another sense, they won, because we are their inheritors. We are their, you can say, we are their reincarnation, among many others. It has its roots in all people who struggled for justice and struggled for freedom and struggled for their liberation. And more recently, I would say, out of the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the 60s, were born many, many movements for liberation and for justice. including the women's movement, the gay rights movement, many kinds of movements for indigenous peoples that weren't born out of the civil rights movement, but certainly got a big boost from it. Many movements of liberation. One of those movements that developed in the 70s and the 80s was the anti-nuclear movement. When after 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, people got very alarmed about the dangers first of nuclear power and started to organize campaigns in the U.S. against places like the Seabrook power plant in New Hampshire and the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in Central California. And people came out of a kind of Quaker anarchist tradition called Movement for a New Society that did a lot of trainings for those actions. And they taught people to work with consensus, to organize in affinity groups, which are small groups that get together to take action together, to organize in a way where all the action decisions were made from the bottom up instead of from the top down. Out of those movements, in California, we blockaded at Diablo Canyon in 1981 5,000 arrests over a period of about 3 weeks. People would get in jail for 4 days or so, get let out, go back to the blockade, hike into the security zone, trying to get into the place where they were trying to put the nuke, get the nuke fired up, get arrested again, and then all of that organizing and all of that time in jail was kind of like an occupation. And we had a lot of discussions about what we're going to do. And one of the things we decided we should do was, let's take this form of organizing and use it to contest not just nuclear power, but nuclear weapons and the buildup that Reagan was starting to do around the Soviets. So we began organizing around places like the Livermore Weapons Lab and Vandenberg Air Force Base and the Nevada test site. Within a few years, we were also saying, this form of organizing is very powerful. We should be using this around America's military intervention in Latin America and in other places. And then other people took it and said, this form of organizing is very powerful. We should be using it around some of these big environmental and land protection and forest protection issues, like headwaters down in California, or Clayoquot Sound up here in Vancouver Island, and many other places. In the late 90s, some of the people who'd been involved in all of those kinds of organizing organized a big blockade in Seattle against the World Trade Organization to focus attention on these big systems of global economics that were tremendously unjust. We brought that same form of horizontal organizing into the global justice movement, and that ignited 10 years of activism around those global justice issues. In the last year or so, there have been people who've been organizing bank actions in New York all last year, all spring, in Ohio, and all kinds of other places to help people take these issues and bring forth again that focus on economic injustice. So when people marched down and set up their tents at Wall Street on September 20th, they didn't do it just out of the clear blue sky, right? They did it out of this heritage of people who've been doing this form of activism back and back and back. And I think that's something that we can all feel proud of and all feel connected to. That all of us who've been involved in the Occupy movement in some way, whether you were down here on day one camping, or whether you've been supporting it in some other way by bringing food, or by coming to meetings when you can come to meetings, or